Hello, my fellow seekers. The next video in the water series is going to take time. Turns out the orbital mechanics of Saturn's rings are a bit complex. So I thought I'd try a quick vid on a topic I'm more familiar with. Film. As it happens, I'm something of a movie buff, as well as an incurable space nerd, so I thought I might try my hand at combining my two passions to see what emerges. My initial plan was to review the wonderful Arrival, but unraveling the deep science at the heart of that film's ideas would take longer than a water video, so I thought I'd start with a subject that would be somewhat easier to dissect. Much easier. Shooting planets in a barrel comes to mind. I refer to the 2011 art sci-fi masterpiece, Melancholia. And now, because this is the internet, a disclaimer. This will be, mostly, a review. It concerns opinion, not facts. If you wish to argue my factual accuracy, I would welcome a correction. If you have an opinion at variance with mine, please state so in a civil way. It encourages conversation. Also, I will be spoiling the ever-loving heck out of this film, so if you do plan to see it, please do so before watching this review. I will include a link to a legal, free version at archive.org in the description. Keep in mind, the film and its director go into some pretty intense territory, so viewer discretion is advised. And, unfortunately, that goes for this review as well. Finally, this will be a long review, so I've decided to break it up into easily navigable parts with the time codes for each in the description. Thank you. Melancholia was directed by Danish art house provocateur Lars von Trier, a man whose films typically combine spectacular visuals, meditations on spirituality, and obtuse, brazenly wrong-headed socio-political commentary. One of several world-ending disaster films released in the hot miasma of apocalypse hysteria in the lead-up to 2012, it concerns a single, very rich family and their slow realization that a giant rogue planet called Melancholia, currently passing through their solar system, will indeed collide with Earth and destroy it. Unlike others of its ilk, Melancholia managed to brush off any claims of cynically manipulating the fears of the masses because it was art, and making a grand statement about the human condition. To be fair, I'm not clear how aware Lars von Trier was of the extent and intensity of the cultural insanity he was drawing on. I think he just thought it would make a fitting vehicle for his message. And it is a message I certainly empathize with. I just wish he'd chosen a different vehicle. Like many people, I have issues with Lars von Trier. I imagine even the most forgiving of art house patrons would have issues with Lars von Trier. I'm fairly certain even Lars von Trier has issues with Lars von Trier. Though, since little of what he says or does makes any logical sense, I'm less sure what those issues are. Over the course of his career, he's managed to insult people with cerebral palsy and developmental disorders. I, for the record, have both. Declare himself a Nazi for no discernible reason.
And then I found out that I was really a Nazi because my family was German, Hartmann, which also gave me some pleasure. What can I say? I understand Hitler.
And drive his actresses to increasingly degrading depictions of psychosexual torment, to the point of being accused of sexual harassment by one of them. There is, however, one issue from which I can draw some sympathy for the man. We both suffer from clinical depression. And, as its name suggests, Melancholia is von Trier's most direct examination of his condition in film. Depression is not sadness. It is a deep, adamantine conviction of the soul that both you and the entire world are utterly beyond salvation. When cracked, its core is often revealed to be rage, not grief, churning like an engine of magma. Rage against a world without logic or justice, and a humanity that allows it to exist. Dick Cavett once said that depression is 20/20 vision, the ability to see the world as it really is, devoid of the illusions we gift ourselves. But this rage will not galvanize you to change the world or fight the malevolent powers that bedevil us. Rather, it is turned inward, collapsing like a dying star and dragging its victims down into impotent invalidity. Depression needs no grand underlying cause. In fact, its triggers can be remarkably trivial. The mere fact that it can be countered with pills shows that it has no rationale. It simply is. It forges its path through your life, leaving devastation in its wake, and then departs, frequently with little explanation, much like a rogue planet passing through our solar system. In fact, the metaphor goes deeper than that. Melancholia is a term from medieval and Renaissance medicine, meaning, essentially, an excess of black bile. According to the remarkably wrong ideas of the Greek physician Galen, which formed the standard for medical knowledge until the turn of the 19th century, health was maintained through a balance of four, quote, humors, or fluids that flowed through the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, or chole, and black bile, melanchole. Thus, someone with an overabundance of any one of these four humors could be described as sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, or melancholic. To balance these four humors, Galen recommended the letting of blood, and so is likely responsible for the preventable deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of patients over the last 2 millennia. Melancholia was said to originate in the spleen, a word we still use to denote irritability. Galen described the symptoms of melancholia not only in terms we would now ascribe to depression, despondency, fear, but also as a form of delusion. Quote, "There are patients who think to have become a sort of snail, so that they must escape everyone in order to avoid having their shell crushed, while others fear that Atlas, who supports the world, may grow weary and vanish." Unquote. Even then, for the depressive, the distinction between the self and the universe entire was nil. Because medical knowledge of the time was largely non-existent, the casting of horoscopes formed a major component of diagnosis. The great astronomers of the Renaissance, such as Galileo or Kepler, drew portions of their income from medical horoscopes. Each of the four humors was assigned a planet. Blood was tied to Jupiter, and someone for whom blood dominated, who was seen as happy and optimistic or in good humor, was known as jovial. Melancholia was tied to Saturn, the most distant and slowest of the planets, the planet of merciless time and the decay of old age. Thus, someone with an excess of melancholia was described as Saturnine. So Melancholia had always been a planet, even before von Trier took the rather awkward step of naming one after it. The fact that this film is set in a universe in which the learned folk of the IAU deign to christen a planet Melancholia should be the first indication that it is a fantasy and should be treated as such. That raises the question of how fiercely I should lambast it for its many astronomical transgressions. And perhaps, under other circumstances, I might have forgiven von Trier for his obvious lack of care on the issue. But he stepped on my toes. Von Trier openly admitted that he drew the idea for Melancholia from the various apocalypse sites he perused online regarding a future collision between Earth and a vaguely defined planetary body. While I will not begrudge him his artistic inspirations, I think, particularly in light of recent events, there should be a moratorium on gaining such inspiration from the internet. I don't think I've mentioned this before, but I began this channel because I had spent the previous several years writing space-related articles for Wikipedia, but got sick of journalists quoting me without attribution and decided to receive at least some credit for my work. While on the site, one planetary project I undertook gradually ballooned out of all proportion. I've actually mentioned it before in another video, so any long-time viewers of my videos might want to skip forward to the movie review, which begins in part 3. Or, if you're understandably reluctant to listen to me talking about depression for 11 solid minutes, skip forward to the astronomical review, which begins in part 4. It all began with a woman named Nancy Lieder, who in 1995 declared herself the emissary of gray aliens from the Zeta Reticuli star system, whose messages she transmits in their voices — she despises the word channels — through an implant in her brain. Though she, or her aliens, depending on what you believe, opined on a number of subjects, such as the non-existence of Comet Hale-Bopp, her true gospel was that of Planet X, or Nibiru, a planet from a distant part of the solar system that was due to pass by Earth in 2003, whose electromagnetic field would flip the Earth like a ball of pizza dough, causing the end of human civilization. Precisely why this particular lunatic idea managed to gain such traction, while other lunatic ideas formed around the same time have not, such as Alexander Abian and his plan to blow up the moon, I cannot say, but it has proven remarkably difficult to kill. After failing to appear in 2003, it re-emerged again in 2007, this time as part of the great 2012 Mayan apocalypse, an article I've also heavily contributed to. When that failed to materialize, its date shifted again, and again, most recently to this very year, pumped by that bastion of steadfast probity, the British tabloid press. As it grew, the threat's shape and form shifted with each new teller, sometimes a planet, sometimes an asteroid, sometimes a fleet of invading spaceships. As Nancy Leader receded into the background, her role in the story was gradually forgotten, though she still has a small perch on the loonier fringes of social media. But her story was spiraling out of control. Fears of a Nibiru-like planetary collision became so intense that people began writing to NASA asking if they should commit suicide. So when I began the article on what became known as the, quote, Nibiru cataclysm, a name I chose specifically to placate Leader, who hated all the earlier ones, I worked with a sense of urgency. I wanted there to be at least one article on the internet that presented the facts as understood by those learned in fields relevant to the topic. For some time, it remained the only one. It's impossible for me to know if I ultimately made a difference, but I can take some solace in the fact that my article is now the top Google search item for the word Nibiru. So, I hope you understand I had, and indeed still have, a very personal stake in countering the effects of any work of art that seeks to exploit the misinformation and paranoia of the Nibiru phenomenon. And in truth, Melancholia wasn't even the worst offender. That dubious honor belongs to Mr. Explodey-Pants Roland Emmerich's 2009 mega-budget disaster movie 2012, whose first trailer memorably commanded its viewers to, quote, find out the truth, Google 2012, thus directly incorporating the panic of the time into its marketing. The filmmakers posted numerous stealth sites and stealth advertisements across new and old media, all proclaiming the end of the world, some referring directly to Nibiru, none mentioning any connection whatsoever to a film. The film, by the way, was a smash hit, showing, and not for the last time, the incalculable value of morally bankrupt marketing. You're probably asking yourself at this point why I'm not focusing my ire on that film instead. Well, first, for all the Titanic hype that attended 2012 before its release, the film has had a remarkably short afterlife. The year 2012 has come and gone, and with it, any spell the film might have had. While critics were never kind to it, audiences seem to have forgotten it too. Many would be surprised to learn that it made $750 million. Conversely, Melancholia is still a very well-regarded film, considered a high point in the careers of both von Trier and its star Kirsten Dunst, who won the Palme d'Or at Cannes for her role. Also, despite his best efforts, Lars von Trier is still a respected, credible filmmaker, while Emmerich has failed to recapture his glory days as a box-office powerhouse. Finally, and most importantly, 2012 is over. Nibiru, on the other hand, is still rolling on, still roping in the gullible, and still causing panic. At its core, this film is not about planetary collisions. It is about depression, and I will be viewing it both as a diagnosed clinical depressive and as a lover of astronomy. I won't lie. For me, this film was hard to watch. Not so much because it got the astronomy wrong, although it did, but because it got the depression hideously right. Most of the time. Please note, I am not a doctor. My knowledge of depression is based on a lifetime of personal experience with the illness. I can understand if you don't want a detailed examination of depression and its effects, so if that doesn't float your boat, feel free to skip to part 4 and get straight to the astronomy. The entire film is set in and around a stately manor house in some unidentified coastal idyll. In the real world, the house is in southern Sweden, but in the world of the film, its location is not specified and frankly doesn't matter. It is its own universe, coming into being at the start of the film, as all film universes do, and ceasing to exist at the end. I think von Trier's use of a multinational cast, including not only the American Kirsten Dunst, but long-standing members of the von Trier rep group like the Swedish Stellan Skarsgård, German Udo Kier, Anglo-French Charlotte Gainsbourg, and oh-so-English John Hurt, serves to unmoor the setting in place and time. As is the norm in von Trier's films, Melancholia is divided into parts. Part 1 is named for the main character, Justine, played by Kirsten Dunst, and plays out over the course of a few hours as it documents her descent into depression and nihilistic self-destruction. The second is named for her sister, Claire, played by Charlotte Gainsbourg, and takes place over a slightly longer period of time as she grapples with the prospect of literal annihilation. Both segments are preceded by a short opening montage that owes a lot to 2001: A Space Odyssey. While it superficially evokes the events at the end of the film, it is not a preview. It does reference later events, but nothing plays out exactly as we see. The camera work is too polished, with none of the shaky handheld that so defines von Trier's work. Some images, such as Justine playing Ophelia, or metaphorically dragging her depression around with her, are never seen again in any form. I don't think it's too glib to say that this short piece effectively acts as a trailer, giving an overview of the film's themes whilst only touching on plot. As the film proper opens, it does all it can to drive home that there is absolutely nothing wrong. No sarcasm quotes either. As far as we can see, Justine is perfectly happy and content. She has just been married, and her beau is the embodiment of idealized sensitive manliness, a fact von Trier drives home by casting him with True Blood's Alexander Skarsgård, son of Stellan, brother of Bill, and certified Nordic dreamboat. We get no sense that she has cold feet, or is having any second thoughts. When her ridiculously oversized limo gets stuck on the country road, she bears the delay with grace and a smile, unlike those around her. When she arrives, her sister Claire, and Claire's husband John, played Jack Boweringly by Kiefer Sutherland, lambast her for being late, and for ruining their party. As the party begins, Justine seems utterly at ease, and then her parents, played by John Hurt and Charlotte Rampling, stand to toast their daughter.
I wasn't at the church. I don't believe in marriage. Claire, who I've always taken for a sensible girl, you arranged a spectacular party. Till death do us part, and forever and ever, Justin and Michael. I just have one thing to say. Enjoy it while it lasts. I myself hate marriages.
Oh, and that's not a misread. She calls her Justin again later. Makes no sense, but this is von Trier. It is at this point, and only this point, that Justine enters her depressive spiral.
When Justin took her first crap on her body, I wasn't there. When she had her first sexual intercourse, I wasn't there. So give me a break, please, with all your rituals.
Have I mentioned that depression is hereditary? Justine's father also forgets her name, confusing her with a girl he's been flirting with. But it's Claire's reaction to their parents' viciously selfish behavior that truly stings. Recognizing that her sister is beginning to fall, she drags her off and...
Listen to me. We agreed that you weren't going to make any scenes tonight.
We don't want any scenes.
No, we don't.
Make a scene? You mean like the one your parents just made? Once again, this was your party! Why did you invite them in the first place, particularly when you knew your sister suffered from depression and would likely be triggered by one of their outbursts?
She ruined my wedding. I will not look at her.
This reception was never for Justine. It was crafted according to the desires of its organizers with no thought to her needs. Once the spiral begins, the tension mounts. At first, Justine does everything a depressive trapped in a public situation should do. She apologizes, smiles, goes through all the right motions, and when that fails, she takes one of the few effective non-medical treatments for depression, a brisk walk. And then oh, come on, Lars! At this point, the reception should have been called off. In any sane world, precautions would have been taken so that this point was never reached. Instead, John takes the worst possible course of action and goes full 24 on Justine.
You'd better be goddamn happy.
Yes, I should be. I really should be.
Do you have any idea how much this party cost me? A ballpark figure.
No. I don't. Should I?
Yes, I think you should. A great deal of money. A huge amount of money. In fact, for most people, an arm and a leg.
I hope you feel it's well spent.
Well, that depends on whether or not we have a deal.
This is a very common demand made of the depressed. Be happy or else. It's not enough that you do what is expected of you. You must also enjoy it. It is particularly common in the US, so it is quite fitting that Kiefer Sutherland, for years the embodiment of right-wing American enforced conformity, makes it here. That is not to say that depression has only one victim. It is a supremely selfish illness, pulling all around it into its narcissistic spiral. But that also makes it extremely dangerous. Left untended, it can rot and putrefy, leaking out in streams of undirected hate. Justine's boss has just given her a promotion, but spends the reception hounding her for a pointless tagline. It is then that she turns on him and destroys her own life.
Nothing is too much for you, Jack. I hate you and your firm so deeply I couldn't find the words to describe it. You are a despicable, power-hungry little man, Jack.
Von Trier seems to be of the opinion that depression is some kind of heightened state of consciousness. Many references are made to lies. Justine works in advertising. She lies for a living, and when depression brings her to a state of true knowledge, she cannot bear the hypocrisy. Alone among the guests, she seems aware of the catastrophe to come, though she can't put her fear in words.
No, it's something else. I'm frightened, Mom.
Later in the movie, Von Trier even makes Justine privy to knowledge she could not possibly have learned herself, as if the 20/20 vision of depression had extended into outright precognition.
678. The bean lottery. Nobody guessed the amount of beans in the bottle.
No, that's right.
But I know.
I'm sorry, Lars, but depression is nothing like that. It is not a gateway to truth or any higher understanding. There is no truth in how we feel, because we feel everything. We hate those we love and love those we hate. The same act may be born of both valor and cowardice. We love the beauty of a sunrise, but hate the start of yet another day. All of these feelings are true. All depression does is discard those we most want to keep. Von Trier's utter and complete wrong-headedness about depression in this regard climaxes in probably the worst scene in the movie, and the one action for which I cannot forgive Justine. Here, Von Trier appears to be suggesting that Justine's depression has granted her such a god's-eye view of the nihilistic void at the heart of reality that she no longer sees the point of her husband's love, and decides to take it from herself. While this is something I can imagine a chronic depressive doing, it's hard to see her doing it like that. Anyone with even a scrap of knowledge of depression should know that one of the first things it does is utterly destroy sexual desire. And so Justine ends her segment having completely poisoned her family, her marriage, and her career. Cut to part 2. Although part 2 is named for Claire, it is just as much, if not more, still about Justine. Now the cast has been reduced to 4. Justine, Claire, John, and their son, the rather cringingly named Leo. Time has passed, though how much we are not told. Justine's depression has reached clinical levels, and is having physical effects. She turns to her sister because she has nowhere else to go. To someone who has not reached this point, Justine's behavior may seem ungrateful, even conniving, but as someone who has, let me tell you, that immobility is very real, as is the inability to taste food. Here, Von Trier's decision to cast Dunst truly shines through. Dunst, like Von Trier, has endured clinical depression in the past, and her experience is clearly showing in her body language. And here is also when I can finally talk about the things my audience wants to know, because now Melancholia shows up. Actually, it showed up a few minutes before this, because Lars just couldn't hold in the stellar stupidity.
The red star is missing from Scorpio. Antares is no longer there.
Excuse me, but it's daytime. I don't care how dimly you digitally grade it, that's still a blue sky. Other than the sun and the moon, supernovae, and the very occasional comet, there are only 3 things in the sky visible when it is blue: Venus, Jupiter, and for the exceptionally gifted of sight, Mars. That's it. Not even Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, can be seen in blue sky conditions. And Antares isn't even a particularly bright star. It's about 5 times dimmer than Sirius, and there are about 15 other stars brighter than it.
It's a planet that has been hiding behind the sun, and now it passes by us.
Of all the claims made in this film, none tick me off more than this one. Not because it is the most ludicrous, there is little light between these examples, but because it is the only one taken directly from the ball of crazy that is the Nibiru conspiracy.
There's no consistency on where they say it is. Some people say it's been hiding behind the sun, that's why we can't see it. Others say it's coming up from the south, so it can only be seen from the southern hemisphere. Some people actually sent me coordinates, and they turned out to be a plain ordinary spot of sky in the constellation Orion, where there's nothing.
There is one small problem with the idea that any killer planet could have hidden from our sight behind the sun. Earth orbits the sun. We go behind the sun for 6 months out of every year. There's not a single scrap of the night sky that is not visible to us somewhere on Earth at some point in the year. Our most powerful telescopes are capable of seeing down to about 30th magnitude, or 1 trillion times dimmer than Antares. The film is piquingly vague about what exactly Melancholia is, but this image suggests that it is a terrestrial planet about 4 times the size of Earth, or about the size of Neptune. To be 30th magnitude, an object the size of Neptune would be 4,800 astronomical units away. That's more than 1,000 times the distance to Pluto. Even if Melancholia were traveling at 230 kilometers per second, the sun's speed through the galaxy, we would still have nearly 100 years warning time. If it were traveling at a speed comparable to the recently observed interstellar asteroid Oumuamua, then we have nearly 1,000 years.
We'll be here in 5 days, and it is not going to hit us. Just like it didn't hit Mercury, as we knew it wouldn't. And it didn't hit Venus, as we well knew it wouldn't. And it won't hit Earth, as we know it won't.
So it flew by Mercury, then Venus, then Earth? Lars, you are aware that the planets in the solar system move, right? I mean, they're not just conveniently lined up like in a textbook illustration.
I can't breathe.
Just relax. This is normal. It's taking part of our atmosphere. For a little while, it'll make us winded.
Oh boy. This one hurts. First off, John, I can think of many words to describe an imminent close encounter between the Earth and a far larger extrasolar planet, but normal isn't one of them. Also, people generally begin to experience shortness of breath at around 0.75 atmospheres, which means that Melancholia would have to have come close enough to Earth to lift off 1/4 of our atmosphere. That's a lot, and it's not coming back. For comparison, say hello to this little fellow. You might have seen him before. He's 1/81st our planet's mass and nearly 400,000 kilometers away. His gravity is strong enough to raise our entire ocean by 1/2 meter every day. Keep in mind that, as Galileo showed, gravity doesn't distinguish between heavy and light things. So if Melancholia were close enough to pull our atmosphere, it would also be close enough to pull our ocean and our land. If Melancholia were truly a terrestrial planet about the size of Neptune, then its gravity would be truly monstrous. The closest analog to Melancholia on record is Kepler 277c, an exoplanet found in 2013. It is about 3.5 times the size of the Earth, but its mass is a ridiculous 67 times Earth's. That's more than 2/3 the mass of Saturn, which, packed into such a small object, would give it a surface gravity about twice that of Jupiter. For reference, this is Io, the innermost of Jupiter's Galilean moons. It orbits about as far away from Jupiter as our moon does from us. Notice the giant volcanoes continuously erupting on its surface? Those are caused by Jupiter's gravity, which, remember, is half that of Melancolia's, and Io doesn't have any oceans to rise up. At the very least, an object as vast as Melancholia, passing by us, would grant us ringside seats to a live reenactment of the Book of Revelation. Then there's this bit, when Claire takes Roland Emmerich's advice and follows up the Doomsday Prophets online, where she comes across this little gem. Just glancing at it, I'm sure you've noticed one particular problem with that image, yes? Earth isn't moving. The only way this diagram could make any sense is if Melancholia were caught by Earth's gravity and sent temporarily into its orbit. But as we've already established, Melancholia's gravity is more than twice that of Jupiter. It would not be orbiting Earth. Earth would be orbiting it.
I'm saying that when dealing with science and calculations of this magnitude, you have to account for a margin of error. That's all I'm saying.
Actually, no, John. The margins of error for Melancholia's predicted path would be almost ludicrously tiny because, as previously stated, we would have almost 100 years to calculate them. For a film about the apocalypse, Melancholia does surprisingly little to engage our awe or terror. There is a slight shift in lighting. The first chapter is filmed in soft, lush browns and golds, but the second is filmed in icy, washed-out colors, presumably to indicate Melancholia's baleful glare. Also, the approach of the planet is indicated by a distant, ever-present rumble, akin to rushing wind. Though, since there is no air in space, it's difficult to know where that sound could be coming from, unless it actually is an earthquake, in which case one wonders why Lars von Trier didn't go to the trouble of mentioning that in the script. That's about it. This is very much of the with a whimper school of going out. We don't even know if there still is a world beyond these immaculate gardens. This broken family could be, and as far as the film is concerned, is, the last of humanity. Each of these 4 final humans confronts the looming secession of their respective existences according to their character. For Justine, it is a vindication. The nihilism and bitterness that has consumed her soul has reached out and swallowed the entire world. She finds herself at home in this new world, as she could never be in the old. For the fastidious Claire, whose sole desire is that the world be as perfect as possible, it is a dissolution. As her sister revives, Claire collapses. For John, the lover of science, all the hopes and faith he placed in rationality and order have come crashing down. John had spent the entire film reassuring and cosseting his loved ones of the infallibility of science's predictions.
Sweetheart, you have to trust the scientists.
Except, of course, when they describe depression as an illness.
She's a bad influence on you and Leo.
She's ill.
Right.
So, of course, we're totally against him when he says this.
Prophets of doom, they'll write whatever they can to attract attention.
Yes, Lars, they will. Way to keep away the crows with that straw man. The only time he speaks kindly is when illuminating others of the wonders of astronomy. I can't help but relate to that. When he finally accepts that all the power of science has failed and the lunatics were right, he commits suicide, the only character to do so. As for Leo, he reacts as a child would, seeking comfort and reassurance from those meant to protect him. Claire protects him from his father's death, while Justine, in a sudden burst of empathy, helps him construct a magic cave to protect him from the inevitable. Von Trier rarely scores his films, preferring either diegetic music, music performed in the world of the film, appropriated music,
every day I spend my time drinking wine, feeling fine, waiting here to find the sign,
or, most often, no music at all. The recurring motif employed in this film is taken from Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, an opera about a couple who initially try to kill each other, but are forced into love after inadvertently drinking a love potion, and then must conceal their feelings while strapped at court. Yeah, it's complicated, but you see the analogy. Of course, Wagner is most famous for his Ring cycle, which ended with Gotterdammerung, a retelling of Ragnarok. Wagner was a follower of the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who, in line with Buddhism, saw mankind driven to misery by desires, and the world as a pallid representation of an unknowable ultimate reality. Schopenhauer's posthumous protege, Friedrich Nietzsche, whose fingerprints are all over von Trier's work, saw art, religion, and even, to some extent, science as convenient illusions employed to shield humanity from the meaningless bleakness at the core of existence. A magic cave, as it were. A nihilist, he once said, is a man who judges that the real world ought not to be, and that the world as it ought to be does not exist. Anyone with depression would find those words familiar. Von Trier pays homage to Nietzsche in the film's midpoint, when Justine beats her horse to the ground while her sister watches on horrified. It was witnessing a similar action that finally sent Nietzsche into insanity. I've always been puzzled by the following Nietzsche's philosophy continues to have, given how poorly it worked for him. And so we get to the end of yet another failed attempt at a quickie. Despite my dislike of Lars von Trier's idiosyncrasies and his bizarre, unfocused ideology, I have to confess that, as a film, Melancholia is good. It is beautifully shot, assiduously performed, and artfully constructed. As a depiction of depression, it works, although I doubt anyone watching it who has never experienced depression will gain any real insight into what it means to have the condition. I'm still royally ticked at Lars von Trier for employing a conspiracy theory that has adversely affected the mental states of thousands of people as his metaphor for one person's deteriorating mental state, and for making a villain of the scientific worldview, while at the same time championing the irrational. Melancholia is a good metaphor for depression, as I said earlier, but is it the best one von Trier could have chosen? A looming, unstoppable nemesis that grows ever larger in our sight, gradually overwhelming our world before destroying it? That feels more like a metaphor for cancer, or AIDS. Perhaps a better astronomical metaphor for depression would be a thick black interstellar cloud that swallows our solar system, blocking out the sun and leaving the world in perpetual gloom. As Earth grows colder, life begins to wither and rain turns to snow. It wouldn't have been scientifically accurate either. Interstellar clouds are basically vacuum, and we are currently traveling through one. But it would have been more so than this. Thanks for the intermission, guys. I didn't realize how much I needed this. I was suffering from Saturn burnout, as I've been working on it for months. Let me know if you think my reviews are worth continuing, and please hit me up on Facebook